Soon after, militant group Hamas launched a series of attacks that left around 1,300 Israelis dead on October 7th, India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi issued a statement. Deeply shocked by the news of terrorist attacks in Israel, our thoughts and prayers are with the innocent victims and their families. We stand in solidarity with Israel at this difficult hour, he said on X, a social media website. That clear declaration of support for Israel was seen by many as a sign. In the days after, Modi spoke with the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and said those words again. India stands with Israel. Experts and commentators have argued that Prime Minister Modi's statements mark a decisive shift in India's foreign policy. For decades, New Delhi has tried to maintain a balance between Israel and Palestine, as their bitter conflict has divided the world. Indeed, at one point in time, India was very clearly on the Palestinian side of the conflict. In recent years, though, observers have noted a significant shift in India's stance in the other direction, towards support for Israel. So what is India's stance on the Israel-Palestine conflict? Is India now in the Israeli camp, or is it that Delhi is pursuing a careful balancing act? HT breaks it down for you. Let's begin with a little history. The story of India's policy on the Israel-Palestine issue actually begins before independence, during the nationalist movement against the British. In 1917, Britain declared that it would set up a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, which is roughly around here in the Middle East. After it won the First World War, Britain took over this territory from the Ottoman Empire, and it then facilitated the immigration of thousands of Jews to Palestine through the 1920s and 1930s. At the time, the population of the region was majority Arab, which opposed Britain's policy. This policy also later allowed the creation of Israel in 1948. Now, India's nationalist leaders saw what was happening in Palestine, including the immigration of Jews against the wishes of the local population. They saw it as just another example of Britain's divide and rule tactics. But besides principles, there was also politics involved. The Congress was engaged in a fierce struggle with the Muslim League at the time, which tried to portray the Congress as a party only for Hindus. By taking up the cause of the Palestinians, the Congress hoped to show Muslims that it would also support Islamic causes. In this first phase of India-Israel ties, which lasted from 1948 to 1992, India took a fairly clear stance in favor of Palestine over Israel. Under India's first Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, India voted against Israel's entry into the United Nations in 1949, and although it recognized Israel in 1950, it refused to maintain full diplomatic relations by setting up embassies and exchanging ambassadors. There were a few reasons behind this. First, there were domestic considerations. Congress leaders were worried that India's Muslims would react adversely to a strong relationship with Israel. P.K. Kumaraswamy notes that the Palestinian cause was actually very popular among India's Muslim electorate, and that created a strong incentive for the Congress to support Palestine. Second, there were ideological divisions between India and Israel. Israel was very much seen as close to Western powers like America and Britain, while India was a leader of the non-aligned movement. This meant that India was closely tied to causes like anti-imperialism and solidarity with newly independent African countries. Israel was seen as aligned with the West and a product of imperialism, and this created an ideological division that was difficult to bridge between the two countries. And finally, there was also the Arab factor. India took a pro-Palestine position because it hoped for Arab support on key issues that mattered to India, like Kashmir and Pakistan. During the Cold War, New Delhi treated the Arab-Israeli conflict as a zero-sum game. Support for the Palestinians, it felt, demanded not only unfriendliness towards Israel, but also opposition to normal diplomatic interaction. By denying formal relations with Israel, it sought to project its pro-Arab credentials, said scholar P.K. Kumaraswamy. Now, this thinking dominated India's position on the Israel-Palestine issue for decades, and it's hard to say that India really benefited from this stance. Despite the fact that Israel supported India during the 1962 India-China War and the 1965 and 1971 wars with Pakistan, India in return condemned Israel for the 1961 and 1973 Arab-Israeli wars. Meanwhile, Arab states didn't really provide India the support that it expected during its wars with Pakistan. India's former Foreign Secretary, A.P. Venkateshwaran, made clear that this was just bad diplomacy on India's part. It is a relationship without a quid pro quo. Any relationship that does not involve a quid pro quo is bad diplomacy, since the first principle of diplomacy is reciprocity, he said about the India-Arab relationship. Despite this, India continued with this flawed policy on Israel and Palestine. India boycotted Israel at major sporting events, it refused to allow it to expand its diplomatic representation in India, and continuously voted against it at the United Nations. That policy changed somewhat in 1992, when India accorded full diplomatic status to Israel. India realized that the Cold War was over and the Palestinian cause was no longer as popular in the Arab world as it once was. So it was less diplomatically risky for India to build a close relationship with Israel. Normalization was a paradigm shift. India recognized and admitted that it was possible to establish normal relations with Israel without abandoning its support for the Palestinians. This approach towards the Arab-Israeli conflict was a new experience for India, scholar B.K. Kumaraswamy writes. And this diplomatic normalization in 1992 also began the subtle shift in India's position on the Israel-Palestine issue. Let's call this Phase 2, which focused on more cautious engagement with Israel and a more balanced position on Israel and Palestine. Through the 1990s and the early 2000s, India's engagement with Israel expanded. Bilateral trade went up, and defense ties with Israel became deeper. Israel also reportedly provided key military assistance during the 1999 Kargil War. During the Vajpayee government's tenure, though, the taboo around high-level visits was also broken, as the two sides became more comfortable taking their friendship public. The 2003 visit of controversial Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon to India was a key development, which showed that the Vajpayee government was less afraid to be publicly identified with Israel. While the UPA government, which took office in 2004, was more careful about high-level visits and being seen with Israeli leaders, it still grew bilateral ties with Israel. At the same time, India didn't give up its traditional support for the Palestinian cause. India repeatedly stated that it remains committed to the establishment of a Palestinian state living alongside Israel. It gave millions in aid to Palestine and also maintained high-level ties with Palestinian authorities. It also did vote against Israel at the United Nations on issues like illegal Israeli settlements on Palestinian land. But the key difference in this Phase 2 of India's position on the Israel-Palestine conflict was that India accepted that it could disagree with Israel on its treatment of Palestinians while also building a strong relationship with Tel Aviv. Earlier, India had allowed the Palestine issue to completely dictate its ties with Israel. Now that brings us to what we might call Phase 3, which some say began with Narendra Modi's election as Prime Minister of India in 2014. So what changed? Mainly, Modi's time in office has led to the perception that India has gone from a balanced to a pro-Israeli policy. In 2015 and 2016, India abstained from a UN vote that discussed whether Israel should be brought before the International Criminal Court for its alleged war crimes during the 2014 crisis in Gaza. In 2017, Modi became the first Indian Prime Minister to ever visit Israel. Some have even argued that Modi's Bharatiya Janata Party's brand of Hindu nationalism and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's right-wing Likud and its alliance with far-right internationalists have a common ethno-national anti-Muslim ideology that has drawn the two countries closer together, argues Manjari Chatterjee Miller at the Council of Foreign Relations. India also recently abstained from voting on a resolution calling for the International Court of Justice's view on Israel's occupation of Palestine. Just in 2022, experts also argue that Modi has pushed to treat Israel and Palestine as separate issues, or in other words, to dehyphenate them. During his time, the emotional resonance that the Palestine issue once enjoyed in India has also begun to fade. Modi has also been unafraid to build a very publicly close friendship with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. This very public friendship between the two top leaders of the countries has been rare in India-Israel relations. Modi's immediate expression of solidarity with Israel after the October 7th Hamas attacks has also been seen as evidence that India under Modi is no longer uncomfortable being seen as a friend of Israel. India under Modi continues to give Palestine aid, and it also refuses to support some Israeli policies that it considers extreme. Modi even visited Palestine in 2018 and recently spoke to the president of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, as tensions with Israel began to ratchet up. But to many, it seems clear that a new era in India's policy on Israel and Palestine has arrived, and it may be here to stay.